Hello, coming to you from my treatment room this morning. People that know me know that I really love words, and words have such power. They don't help us get through the world. There's hidden messages in words, and I've always been attracted to seeing those and understanding those messages. And the word we're going to look at today is diagnosis. Diagnosis has a double negative. Just the first part of the word die means to cut, to dissect, to digest, to break into, to divorce. Although die always means to cut into two or separate. So we already have separation in that. And then the diagnosis, there is a medical term, agnosia, which has to do with mental confusion. And then there is another word, which all three of these are very similar, agnostic. Agnostic is to be confused about God, to not know for certain. So the word diagnosis is to separate, and to separate not just from our understanding as to confuse us, but also to separate, in my opinion, from spirit or God, which is the only true wellspring of where we get our health, that comes from that connection to source. So a diagnosis has a way of separating us and confusing us from the truth. And a diagnosis is simply a look at something and trying to understand it, but really the truth of what's happening is underneath the diagnosis. So, for example, illness does not come from pathogens or viruses. There's always an issue there first, and then the opportunistic pathogen comes in, and then we look at the pathogen and say that's the issue. As a kid living on my grandparents' farm, I remember seeing bagworms come in, and they would attack certain trees, and other trees they wouldn't bother. And it was the trees that were sick that those bagworms would attack and basically help recycle, is what it's about. And so the bagworm didn't cause the issue. The tree already has an issue. The pathogen already is coming into a system that is already mixed up and confused. So the pathogen is helping point to the truth of the issue, and you got to look underneath the pathogen or the virus to get to the code or the source of what the true issue is. And the true issue is always going to be some kind of separation from source, and a diagnosis even takes us further away. I've even had instances where people were so convinced that God was visiting a test upon them related to their illness that they just couldn't let it go. And that is untrue, because God is the life-giving and life-sustaining force, which means that that force wants us to be thriving and alive, not visiting negativity upon us. So the diagnosis that we receive, when you receive a diagnosis about a particular issue, begin to look underneath it. What was going on before that issue showed up, the pathogen showed up? Cancer is another example. That is something that is showing up to a system that already has issues. So look underneath the diagnosis. Look underneath the pathogen or the virus to see the real truth of what's going on. And don't accept a diagnosis which separates you from spirit and makes an issue that is really maybe not as bad as it sounds, worse, as though it's like a proclamation that something negative is going to happen. In a lot of instances, diagnosis can seem like a death sentence. So don't take a diagnosis so personal, and begin to look underneath what's going on and understand that a diagnosis is confusion. Don't allow that confusion into your mind. Diagnosis, Di-Agnosia, and agnostic, they're all very similar, and they all have to do with confusion and separation. Peace out.